Good afternoon, I'm Danilo Evangelista, and welcome to our video discussion for today, May 22nd, 2024. Today we're talking about big time hurricane season forecasts, or more of them, I should say, this time put out by the UKMET office, which released just today, and they do have really big expectations for this hurricane season. In fact, you can actually see their forecast on the title card, but we'll actually go more in depth into what they show in just a little bit. You'll definitely see it if you watch, and hopefully you will. And we'll also talk about the fact that our first tropical wave formed this season of the hurricane season. So I guess the Atlantic is starting to come to life, even though nothing is expected still over the next 7 days. With that being said, though, let's get right on to today's discussion. And as again I said, there is nothing expected in the Atlantic anytime soon, and neither in the Eastern Pacific as well. Both basins very quiet and very nice and calm indeed. I guess we could say pretty confidently now, the calm before the storm, because as I just mentioned, just seconds before, the UK Met Office came out with their hurricane season forecast this year, and Philip Klotzbach himself said that it continues this trend of predictions for a hyperactive 2024 hurricane season. They say 22 named storms, 12 hurricanes, and 4 majors. And Philip Klotzbach actually links us to the website in which they forecast, which they posted their forecast in. It's once again from the UK Met Office. They release predictions just like everybody else every single year, and this is what their predictions are this year. They have a range anywhere from 16 to, once again, a very high end, whopping 28 named storms, and they think the most likely out of that is 22. They go 8 to 16 hurricanes. The most likely out of that is 12 hurricanes. And from a range of 2 to 6 major hurricanes, they think 4 majors. And when it comes to ACE, and this is what is really eye-popping to me, because this represents that not only do they expect a lot of activity this year, but they also think that the energy output from all of these storms will be very high. And it's also very interesting that they have 200 ACE points expected with only 4 major hurricanes. So maybe that also kind of puts into a little bit of a perspective. Maybe they have more of a quality sort of expectation for this hurricane season, but nonetheless, I mean, 200 ACE points, anything over 200 is already very much based on a year that we're expecting a lot of intense storms, and quality is more or less a term that we use in the hurricane tracking community to represent very long lasting and very intense storms for longer periods of time, therefore racking up more energy that is being output, which is what we measure with the accumulated cyclone energy index, which is what ACE is. And that ranges anywhere from 131, which is their low end range, to once again a very high end 293 ACE points, and that is actually record. I think the record is by 1933, which, by the way, is a year that a lot of people are throwing out this year. That record was only at around 258 points, or I think around 259. This year, their range, although that's not what they're saying is their middle ground, but their range goes beyond, well beyond that record-breaking territory into 293, and it's very interesting because, as I mentioned, and we actually talked about this yesterday, and by the way, I'm using Wikipedia for this because it is a really nice website. I don't care what everybody says, Wikipedia is a very nice website. They have all the information you need displayed out in a table like this. Besides Philip Klotzbach, which has somewhat of a table like this, although he includes more forecasters, Wikipedia has a table right here with their 2024 hurricane season page, in which they represent and they kind of showcase what all the major forecasting agencies have put out so far. And it's really nice to look at so we could compare and see what have everybody else forecast so far, and kind of compare where everybody is in terms of the general range of what the forecasts are this year. And as Philip Klotzbach said, he even mentioned in his tweet, it is a continuation of hyperactive hurricane season forecasts going all the way back to when TSR released their forecast in December, and they had 20 named storms. And since then, basically everybody has said at least 20 or more. And it just goes into the fact to show everybody is kind of seeing this year for what it is. It's just the factors are laid out when it comes to the potential for a very active hurricane season. And I'll go over it with you again when we look at the sea surface temperature anomalies. And it really is not hype. It's not like we're trying to doomcast and say that this year will be the worst hurricane season ever. It's just the fact that a lot of these people, we have experiences when we had really warm Atlantics in all years, basically all years past, when the Atlantic was anywhere near as warm as it is right now. And we have this La Nina coming on in the Pacific. This is what this cold tongue is, if you're not familiar with it, by the way. La Nina incoming, and we have an Atlantic that is as warm as it is. It just almost always, when you put the two together, it almost always comes together to create the most perfect hurricane season setup, or one of the most perfect setups you can get. And even with this colder look to the north, kind of represents more of a I guess you could say dipole situation, or even tripole. I'm not sure, but um, cold over warm. Generally, it kind of helps in terms of the dynamics in the ocean, in which it helps concentrate the warm waters in the deep tropics instead of having energy stretched out all over the place. Bottom line, the configuration for sea surface temperature anomalies is very, very favorable. On top of the fact that it's very warm, just based on the anomalies themselves in terms of the departures from normal they are. Just look at this widespread 2 Celsius readings all across the MDR. We don't even need to go over it, but generally you get the idea. All of these forecasts, including now the UKMET, which today came out with their forecasts, kind of adding on to the idea that the Atlantic look that we have this year is definitely that of an active hurricane season, and it just continues to confirm what everybody's been saying so far about this year. And not only taking a look at sea surface temperature anomalies, but the raw sea surface temperatures themselves in and throughout the Caribbean. It's just really, really, it's just really, really warm. We have readings throughout the Caribbean consistently in the mid to upper 80s, which is around the mid to upper 20 Celsius's. We have 29, even some 30s down near Cuba. The Caribbean has been near record warm, and even Brian McNulty talks about this. Not only are we record warm in terms of actual anomalies, but he mentions that it is still wild, I should say, that the tropical Atlantic basin is still record-breaking warm, with not only the actual temperatures, but below the surface too, the ocean heat content is record high in those same sectors. This is what he mentions, and he goes to show upper ocean heat content. This is the average of what we typically see in terms of upper ocean heat content in a year. This is, I assume, what last year was, and this is where we are this year. We're well ahead of what we're supposed to be. And notice how when we average out and we take a look at the level that we are right now this year, and we look at where we're supposed to be in terms of the average, it comes down to August. So basically, in the tropical Atlantic right now, the map represents that upper ocean heat content wise, we're on par with August. And just really quickly go through the other basins that he shows, because not only he shows the tropical Atlantic, but he shows the Caribbean. That is also record warm too. And in the Gulf of Mexico too. And this is really significant in the Gulf of Mexico as well, because the Gulf of Mexico, no matter what, will always be warm for development, even if it's just right where it should be, near normal. By the time we get to the peak, it almost always reaches very warm levels in the Gulf. It just almost always warms up, and it's inevitable. But the fact that this year we're seeing that warming occur on a much earlier level, and on a much higher level than typical, it is very concerning. And not to mention that the fact that these maps, they're not even representing the actual sea surface temperature anomalies being record breaking, but the upper ocean heat content as well, because not only means that we have a record amount of heat at the surface reflected in the extreme sea surface temperature anomalies and sea surface temperatures themselves, but we also have a record amount of heat being stored below the surface, which just means that there's more energy overall for storms to take advantage of, and that just spells absolute trouble. And it definitely is a very interesting picture when it comes to stuff that does get going. And I talked about it. The early season will be very interesting, especially throughout the Caribbean and Gulf, when that's when we typically see our first kind of things to get going in a year. They typically come out of the Caribbean and especially in the Gulf. And the fact that we're in May 22nd, in the latter half of May, and at least per the CDAS, because we sometimes use different methodologies. Like sometimes I use the maps that NOAA has, but today I decided to use CDAS from Tropical Tidbits, which, by the way, is a website made by Levi Cowan. Very, very, very respected tropical analysts on the Twitter weather community, and he also has his own outlook with the 2024 hurricane season that he released several days ago. Not trying to promote him, but like he is really good, and he puts all these maps together, which we all use on a regular basis. Not only when it comes to these maps, but even the visible imagery stuff, which I'm going to show you in a little bit for the tropical wave, and even the models too. But he puts all these maps together, and just decided why not give him a shout out. But anyways, back to what I was saying. In the Gulf, just really warm and ahead of. We're not even in the hurricane season yet, and we already see anomalies this warm in the Gulf. It just makes it all that more interesting when it comes to when things do get going and we do see our first storms form for the hurricane season. But as I did mention, though, I was going to talk about the fact that we do have our first tropical wave, and I guess it didn't set up the tweet directly to kind of be centered on it. But yeah, our first tropical wave of the season is here. Atlantic, even though we don't have our first named storm yet, Atlantic is beginning to show signs of life. The first tropical wave of 2024 has been analyzed by the 12Z surface analysis map along 38 West in the MDR. And basically, if you're not familiar with what tropical waves are, they're basically the impulses of energy that produce themselves. They produce heavy rain, gusty winds, and they tend to be our seedlings for what end up eventually becoming our big hurricanes, or sometimes they don't even become big hurricanes, but they eventually, most of the time, there are our seeds, our seedlings, for tropical development in the Atlantic and even in the Eastern Pacific too. And just to kind of give a close-up, or not even a close-up, but just to kind of represent where this wave is on the map, it's roughly right in here, I believe, and you could actually see it, that there is some sort of cyclonic vorticity, some sort of turning if you actually look closely at the surface. And that's why these tropical waves, that's why we look at these waves for development, because they already have a little bit of that kick that we need when it comes to development, and especially later on in the year when we have more potent waves come off, because let's be honest, this wave is pretty barren and dry. I mean, it's only May, but it is our first wave after all. But once we start getting more of these waves to come off, more potent, and even more further to the north in the very warm MDR that we'll have this year, they're going to have their kick. And once they reach those warm waters of the MDR, they're going to take advantage of that and eventually develop more concentrated thunderstorms and eventually develop well-defined circulations from the already kind of small pockets of vorticity that they already have with them. And we'll get our storms that form out here, or maybe not always out here. Maybe we'll have some that form in the Western Atlantic as well, and there probably will be a lot that form in the Western Atlantic, especially in a year like this. But bottom line, the waves are starting. The wave train is here, as we like to say in the hurricane tracking community. The wave train is here. The waves have started, but obviously this wave is not expected to form. You could even see on satellite the very strong upper level westerly winds, which obviously indicates very strong wind shear, which will prevent this wave from forming. And really quickly, just to kind of put into perspective, since we always talk about vorticity and kind of sniffing these waves out when it comes to vorticity, you can actually see it on the 850 millibar vorticity, this kind of kink in terms of more vorticity kind of associated in this area compared to its surrounding area. So again, small pocket, but it is there when it comes to the amount of vorticity that these waves have. And it's obviously not defined, not compared to maybe something like this that is in the Caribbean. And this is actually this sort of system that we talked about several days ago that was going to bring a lot of rain to the Caribbean islands, which it is doing so right now. That's obviously not, it's definitely not anything like this, even though, by the way, if you're wondering, this won't develop, and we'll actually look at the model in a moment. But anyways, I'm just trying to point out, you could see the wave reflected in the 850 millibar vorticity. These waves come with vorticity, which is why they're referred to as our seeds for development when it comes to activity in the Atlantic. And I mentioned it before, but I'll mention it again. Watch as over the next few weeks we start seeing a lot more of these come off of Africa, and eventually this MDR area will begin to light up a lot when it comes to waves, and probably very soon activity itself will light up, and we'll see a lot of activity occur out here in the MDR. Really quickly though, before we end, just to kind of run through the models really quickly, just to show that nothing is happening. And before I mentioned that, you could actually see that area of vorticity in the Caribbean that we mentioned earlier. That's going to lift north, going to bring a lot of heavy rain and gusty winds to Hispaniola and Puerto Rico and the northern Caribbean islands for, I guess, the next few days before it lifts north. GFS, don't be fooled, because the GFS does have a very defined signature on the vorticity map, but this is, I believe, a non-tropical system. And you could kind of see eventually over the next several days, it lifts north, maybe some gusty winds and some gusty weather to Bermuda, but after that, it lifts north, fizzles out in the northern Atlantic, and then we're at 7 days, and there's nothing, really nothing much of any concern popping out. By then, we're still at May 29th, and the hurricane season is still not here yet. But I guess you could say after we had our first wave, you can say that at least the Atlantic is starting to wake up slowly. And I'm pretty sure within the next several weeks, as we head into early June, we'll probably be watching our first system form. And Alberta will be here, and the 2024 hurricane season will be here. With that being said, though, going to close it out for today. Obviously going to post tomorrow, since, by the way, NOAA's hurricane season prediction will come out tomorrow. We'll get an idea of what they say, and probably, I assume, it'll be a very active hurricane season. But other than that, nothing much else to talk about, and it looks like over the next several weeks or so, or at least in the near future, things will remain quiet. Thanks for watching, though. Stay safe, peace, love, and kindness to all, and we'll talk again very soon. See ya.